What's up guys, Agent here again with another build video, and today we're going to be going over the Stamina Warden Bow build DPS. So I actually played around quite a bit with Stamina Wardens because they actually have probably what I'd say the most flexibility when it comes to potential front bar options in terms of spammables. So as you can see here, I tried out just running just straight up Lethal Arrow. I also tried out running Lethal Arrow with Subterranean Assault. I also tried Subterranean Assault with Cutting Dive, and he also tried Lethal Arrow with Cutting Dive when the enemy is set off balance. And all but one of them pulled fairly similar DPS. So I'm just going to show you guys this rotation here with just Lethal Arrow spam, but I will discuss and also show you guys at least one other parse, taking a look at, I believe, Subterranean Assault plus Lethal Arrow is the parse that I have saved up from today's testing. But moving forward, just like the rest of our build videos, we won't be going over any sort of gear that was covered in the Bow gear video, which should be popping up in the right hand corner right about now. So if you're interested in knowing what sort of gear you should be running, as well as other sort of generic things about a Bow build, check out that video and then come back here. This will be discussing just the skills and the rotation, as well as what sets Stamina Wardens apart from other Bow builds. So starting off with our front bar, this is probably going to have the most discussion for this video here. So in this particular setup here, I am running Lethal Arrow as our main spamble, and then I have 3 fighter skilled abilities, so I have Silver Shards, Camouflaged Hunter, and Barbed Trap for the increase in weapon damage. Now, they did nerf the Advanced Species passive under the Animal's Companions line from 3% to 2% a few patches ago, and because of that, the additional weapon damage that you get from slotting fighter skilled abilities is generally speaking going to be stronger than what you would get from the Advanced Species passive. That's mainly because you have usually have quite a fair amount of damage done modifiers, and so for every single damage done modifier you have, the weaker every additional one is. So even though it says 2% and you would think it's a flat 2%, it actually ends up being pretty weak, actually. It ends up being anywhere between 1.5 to 1.2% effective increase in damage done, which when you compare it mathematically to what increased weapon damage will give you, you get 3% for each weapon, fighter skilled ability that you have slotted. The fighter skilled abilities end up winning out. So even though it's 3% additional weapon damage, that actually translates out to more than the about 1.2 to 1.5% you would get from advanced species. So that's why we're running fighter skilled abilities rather than animal companions abilities, because advanced species is not as strong as the additional weapon damage that you get from the fighter skilled passives. Then we have Poison Injection here on the front bar. You could put this on the back bar, but decided to put it on the front bar just to kind of even things out a little bit. Plus, if you want to run the Masters as the front bar, you're going to want to run Poison Injection on the front bar anyways. And our ultimate is going to be Wild Guardian. Then for our back bar, we have another 3 fighter skilled abilities. So this time I have Ring of Preservation, Camouflaged Hunter, and Barbed Trap. Then I have 2 abilities here, Endless Hail and Bull Netch. So if you are running this particular setup here, where you're running just Lethal Arrow as your spamble, you are going to want to run Bull Netch for the additional sustain. If you're running something like Lethal Arrow with Subterranean Assault, your sustain might be good enough that you don't need to run Bull Netch. When I was trying it out, I was keeping up Bull Netch, and I found that my sustain was really pretty decent. You'll see it when I show you that parse later on, just the amount of resources that I was using up. But for some spamble setups, you might not need to run Bull Netch. Then you have the double bar Wild Guardian here. Now for the front bar, I talked a little bit about the different spamble setups that I tested out. So the ones that I tested out that ended up being fairly close to what I have here is Subterranean Assault with Lethal Arrow here. So you just replace one of your fighter skilled abilities and run Subterranean Assault here. Even though Lethal Arrow has a cast time of 1 second, you're still able to fit in 2 Lethal Arrows pretty decently well before you can use Subterranean Assault again. So I'll show you guys that rotation. Then the other rotation I tried out was, instead of Subterranean Assault, I had Cutting Dive here. Then I used Cutting Dive when enemies were set off balance. This is because when enemies are set off balance, you can spam Cutting Dive to get the bleed going. And so basically what I did was I just basically kept a timer going of when the dummy would be set off balance, and I use Cutting Dive rather than Lethal Arrow when the dummy was set off balance. It's a little bit trickier to maintain and definitely requires a lot more attention, so I don't recommend doing this, but it is one potential way to kind of maximize your overall DPS running Cutting Dive. I did not pull quite as good DPS, but I tested this out yesterday and I didn't save the parse, so I can't exactly show you guys the parse, but it was definitely more challenging to maintain that bleed because you kind of have to pay attention to when off balance is active and when it's not active. So I personally wouldn't recommend this setup here if you're just starting to learn bow builds or you're on a console and you don't have very good debuff trackers. If you're able to track that off balance uptime, then this is something that I think would be pretty competitive with just straight up lethal arrow spam, but again, it is fairly difficult to maintain. And then the final spamble setup that I tried out was Cutting Dive with Subterranean Assault. This actually ended up pulling the lowest out of all the different tests that I ran. You can still run this. The actual sustain ends up doing pretty well. It's very similar to Subterranean Assault with Lethal Arrow though, but the Lethal Arrow as a spamble with Subterranean Assault ended up pulling about 2 to 3k higher on the dummy, so I personally wouldn't really recommend running this unless you're in a situation where you can't really run Lethal Arrow because of that cast time. So there are some downsides of running Lethal Arrow as a spamble. That cast time basically means you can't move around very much, plus you can't do anything else while you're casting, so you can't drink potions, you can't use synergies. You can queue up things like taking synergies, but while you're in that cast animation you can't really do anything. Mainly it's the lack of mobility when you're casting that really kind of kills you, so things like Asylum, for example, might be a little bit more difficult to run Lethal Arrow because you're going to have to be running around every 35 seconds or so to deal with Storm the Heavens. So things to keep in mind when you're trying to figure out what spamble you want to run. For this particular parse though, we will be going with Lethal Arrow spam just because that ended up pulling the most consistently high in terms of overall DPS. Now, if you do need to run any other ability, just take out any fighter skilled ability. So if you want to have like Vigor for a heal, then you can just replace something like Barb Trap here, or Camouflage Hunter, or Silver Shards. Now, in this particular setup, I'd probably replace Silver Shards first. Camouflage Hunter and Barb Trap both might be useful. Camouflage Hunter mainly because of the minor berserk you get from critting on a enemy's flank, which might be useful. Barb Trap or Lightweight Beast Trap for the additional dot if you are able to get within melee range for Barb Trap, or you can just throw out Lightweight Beast Trap. Now for this particular gear setup, I am running Tzogvin, so you will notice that I do not have a source of mana force on my bars here. If I was running something like Lokkestiiz instead, I would be running Child Acceleration or Race Against Time, probably on my back bar here in place of Ring of Preservation. Again, you have 3 flex spots essentially on each of your bars, so you can just replace whatever you need with those fighter skilled abilities on an as needed basis. So if you want to run Elude for a major evasion, you can replace any of the fire skilled ability. Yes, you will end up seeing a DPS loss because you are going to be losing out on that weapon damage, but you are getting some survivability, which might be more beneficial depending on sort of what type of content you're running and at what level. But that pretty much covers it for all the skills. Now in terms of rotation, as you can imagine with the Lethal Arrow spam rotation, pretty straightforward. You just got to maintain Endless Hail and Poison Injection. Just to kind of show you guys what that looks like. And you can just Lethal Arrow spam the whole time, and you just re-up your dots when you need them to be renewed. And so on and so forth. So that would be this Lethal Arrow spam. So it's probably the most straightforward rotation because it's just keeping up essentially 3 dots and then running Lethal Arrow, and then just shoot your ultimate whenever you have it up. Now if you are running Subterranean Assault at all, so let's do Subterranean Assault with Lethal Arrow spam for example, then things get a little bit trickier. So it's still the same core concept, but except instead of your just spamming up Lethal Arrow, you're going to do Subterranean Assault, 2 abilities, Subterranean Assault, 2 abilities. Now, the duration of Subterranean Assault is 3 seconds, which allows you to fit in 2 spammables, 2 global cooldowns essentially, between casts of Subterranean Assault. And even though Lethal Arrow does have a cast time, it's a 1-second cast time, so you're pretty much slotting in almost directly into that sort of 1-second global cooldown there, so you're still able to do 2 Lethal Arrows and then Subterranean Assault. Here's an example of how that would look like. Do Subterranean Assault, 2 abilities. Then you do Subterranean Assault again, and then 2 abilities. You can see here you're able to get 2 Lethal Arrows off. 2 2 abilities off between each cast of Subterranean Assault. And you can even do something like this with fairly minimal loss in sort of Subterranean Assault downtime, so to speak, if you treat it as a dot. And it's the same sort of concept if you're using Cutting Dive rather than Lethal Arrow. It's just instead of a cast time, you just have straight up spammable, so it's just instant cast. And then if you're running Lethal Arrow with Cutting Dive, then you're going to need to start paying attention to your debuff tracker and paying attention to when off balance happens. In that instance, once you see debuff active, that is when you just want to spam Cutting Dive. Just ignore reapplying any of the dots, just spam Cutting Dive because you want all 7 stacks going of that bleed as soon as you can. Once the off balance is done, then you can renew your dots. Chances are your dots probably run out at that point. Renew your dots and then go back to Lethal Arrow spam. But again, that is a fairly complex rotation. I personally wouldn't recommend it if you're just starting off or if you're not really keeping good track of your debuff tracker. So we're going to do a 21 million Dummy Parse here. Now, generally speaking, as a bow build, you're going to want to get as far away as possible in order to take advantage of the long shots passive under the bow line, which increases damage done with bow abilities farther away you are. Now, you are limited if you are running Subterranean Assault to 20 meters. So 20 meters would be, roughly speaking, right around here or so. So you can see here if I use Subterranean Assault, I'm still just barely able to manage to hit the Iron Atronac here, but if I take another step back, here again I'm just barely managing to hit it from right back here. So once you get a little bit further back, you aren't really going to be able to hit it with Subterranean Assault. So this is pretty much exactly where 20 meters is. Let me just double check. Yeah, so right around here is where 20 meters roughly is. So if you're taking a look at these blocks, it's about a little over 1.5, maybe 1 3/4 blocks is kind of your limit here if you're running Subterranean Assault. Now, if you're not running Subterranean Assault, then you pretty much have 28 meters because that is the distance for Poison Injection and Endless Hail. Lethal Arrow has 35 meters, but once you get past 28, you won't be able to Poison Injection. You can see here, can't Poison Injection any longer. Now, another thing I also want to point out here is the bear can be a little bit finicky sometimes. Like the Stamina Warden dual wield build and Magical Wardens, your DPS is kind of a little bit reliant on the bear. Not as badly here compared to like a dual wield build, but it is still kind of reliant on the bear. In those instances where the bear is going to be a little bit finicky, for example, let's say you're running Sunspire on a bow build, don't know why you would necessarily do that, but just for sake of argument, let's say you are doing that. The bear won't be able to hit the dragon, or at least one of the attacks that the bear uses won't be able to hit the dragon. So in that instance, it might not be worth running the bear. If you're fighting, let's say, the triplets in Vhoff with the bow build, the bear has to run around a lot, and while it's running around, it won't be able to hit anything, so it's a DPS loss. In that instance, again, you might want to consider swapping out the bear for a different ultimate. Now, if you are going to swap out the bear, my recommendation would be to run the Fighter Skilled Ultimate Flawless Dawnbreaker on the front bar here for the additional weapon damage, and then run Ballista on the back bar here. Now, if you're running Ballista has a 25 meter range, so you're going to have to close in the distance a little bit more, so around here or so, in order to run Ballista. So just keep that in mind. If you are running Ballista, you will have to get a little bit closer compared to if you're running the bear. The bear doesn't really have a range. If you're able to stay 28 meters away, then do so. So for the 21 million dummy parse, it bears repeating that the 21 million dummy is not necessarily a representation of in-raid trial parses. That's because you do get different buffs and debuffs in a raid than you would on a trial dummy. So for example, the trial dummy is missing things like Zens and Martial Knowledge. It also has 100% uptime and Major Force, which is obviously not very realistic. In terms of sustain, you're missing things like Symphony of Blaze, the Massive Restoration Staff, etc. So don't take this DPS test and basically say, this is what I'll pull in raid. In a raid, your DPS is going to vary quite a bit, just depending on your group, uptimes, things like that. This parse is mainly for rotation purposes, just to kind of show you guys the rotation, as well as a point of comparison to other bow builds, because with the trial dummy, we're standardizing all of our buffs and debuffs. So, with all that said and done, let's go ahead and get started with this parse. Again, we're doing the very, very simple rotation here, which is just lethal arrow spam. You can see here that the DPS does seem to go up and down quite a bit, and that's just because of the travel time of the lethal arrow projectile. Should even out over time. And very boring, very straightforward rotation. So if you're trying to look for, exciting gameplay, this is not the right one for you. I'd probably say if you're looking for something more exciting, go with the Subterranean Assault Parse. At the very least, then you have a little bit of things you kind of keep track of with Subterranean Assault. Now, I will say that this lethal arrow spam is going to be the worst in terms of sustain. And you'll see it when I show you guys the parts at the end of the video. Compared to lethal arrow with Subterranean Assault. Not really much to talk about here. I guess I can mention here that you can queue up using the synergy there by hitting the synergy key while you're in that cast time animation. Something I do recommend getting used to. Unfortunately, you can't do that with potions, so you are going to have to time your potions between lethal arrow spams. For those guys who kind of want more of a visual representation of what off balance will look like, might be a little bit difficult to see from here. Let me see if I can see it pop up. It just went off, so let me see if it'll pop up soon. So if you see there's kind of like whirligigs going on the dummy's head, that's an indication that off balance has been applied. So if you see that, and it does appear on all bosses, even the really large bosses, if you see that on a boss's head, that means off balance is applied, and if you're running cutting dive, that's when you just want to spam cutting dive. I don't know if that endless hail managed to hit it or not. Looks like it is though. You can see here sustain is definitely tricky. You're just running with straight lethal arrow spam. Might need to heavy attack. We'll find out. Hopefully our potion gets up. Okay, we won't need to heavy attack here. That's pretty close though. Now if you are running Lokkestiiz, you're just going to want to pay attention to when you're using your synergies. Run Lokkestiiz front bar, just make sure you're using the synergies on the front bar. Since we're running Tzogvins, we don't need to worry about that at all. But come on. Come on, synergy, pop up. Once you get into the end, like around here, like I have here, you can probably just drop all your dots and just lethal arrow spam for the remainder of the fight. But there you go. Again, very straightforward rotation. If you're kind of looking for exciting rotation, this particular rotation is not it for you. I would probably say run Subterranean Assault with lethal arrow instead. So we pulled 77.6k or so. Again, very simple rotation though. Like this is probably the easiest rotation you can possibly get on ESO outside of just like heavy attack sorc builds or something. But heavy attack sorc builds probably won't be able to pull this level of DPS, depending on how you're making your heavy attack build. But yeah, 77.6k. Not terrible. Again, very straightforward, but sustain is definitely a challenge here. So if you take a look at our stamina, you can see definitely going downhill. Now the good thing is not many fights last this long. Many boss fights don't last this long at all. Or if they do last this long, it's because there is some downtime. Like in Sunspire, for example, boss fights have some downtime, so you have that time to kind of regain some resources passively. Now, let me see if I can find the correct parse here. So... This is another lethal arrow spam, so 78.2k. This is a little bit higher, probably because of RNG. But this is the lethal arrow with Subterranean Assault. So we start using lethal arrows, our main spammable, but we're running Subterranean Assault in between lethal arrow spams. 77.5k. So you can see here about margin of error here, and this one's a little bit more exciting because you got to do Subterranean Assault every 3 seconds or so. But the sustain here is a little bit better. You can still see it's dropping off, but it's not dropping off quite as steep as the lethal arrow spam here. So you can see here, let's say at 100 seconds, we're sitting at about 57% stamina remaining. Here we're sitting closer to about 72%, and you can see here this big drop here is because I just ended up lethal arrow spamming towards the end anyways. So if you want better sustain, I would say run Subterranean Assault instead. Just be mindful that you can't stand as far back like I am over this parse. You have to be within 20 meters instead. But that concludes this build video. If you guys have any questions at all, feel free to leave them down in the comment section below. I'll try to answer all of your questions to the best of my ability. Hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you guys in the next dungeon.